Democritus and the Atomists, which sounds like a 70s indie band, but was not. A little background for a good dead friend Democritus. He lived around 460 to 360 BC, wrote on history, math, epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, metaphysics, ethics, and history. So what's his metaphysical stuff? Well, Democritus is probably among the most famous of the pre-Socratics because of his atoms and the void thing. So he regards reality of consisting of two things. Well, actually, technically one. Atoms and the void. The void is nothing, but is taken as part of the ontology of Democritus and his fellow atomists. So it's nothing that is also part of the ontology. Anyways, metaphysics can be confusing. So what qualities do these atoms have? Now it's important to note that the atoms he's talking about conceptually for him are not the atoms we learn about in physics classes today, because he wasn't aware that there was neutrons, protons, electrons, etc., or particles even smaller than that. But the reason why we call them atoms today is because of Democritus. He kind of came up with this idea. So his atoms have the following qualities. First, they're indivisible, so they cannot be split. They are eternal, and they're also unchanging. So in terms of the basic things that make up everything, for him it'd be atoms, and they couldn't be split anymore. So you couldn't slice them up, which, going back to problems of infinity, it potentially solves some of those, being indivisible. Speaking of infinity, the question of how many atoms are there, his answer is infinite. They also differ in size and shape. One way to think of them is, think, for example, of just a bunch of little plastic bits and in a big bag, although the bag metaphor is probably not that great. And so there are little tiny things that have hooks and various shapes. Some are hooked, some are not, etc. And so, or maybe a better analogy would be think of a breakfast cereal in a void. So how does change work in this metaphysics? Well, according to Democritus, change arises from the different relations between the atoms, and he presents an argument for change. And the argument goes like this. The first step is that according to Democritus, there is no absolute up or down, hence motion is without direction. And this again brings forth a question about is there absolute direction in the universe? And Democritus, of course, would say no. And other thinkers and physicists later on would also say no. Because of this, because there's no absolute up or down, atoms do not have weight in an absolute sense. And so, since these atoms last a natural final resting point, their motion is eternal. So they always move, movement without end. Now, Aristotle was critical of these atoms because they did not address the question of how did the motion begin. Aristotle, of course, comes up with his own concept of this, spoilers, of course, when he presents his unmoved mover. So we have a world of atoms and void. So what about the world of appearance, the world that we seem to see? For Democritus, the motions and shapes of the atoms produce interactions and combinations, and these give us the qualities of sense experience. So what we're experiencing is combinations, interactions of atoms that cause us to have, experiences of sight, taste, etc. And even though Democritus is working with, just little atoms in a very simple sense, this notion that the qualities arise from the what will later be called primary qualities, becomes a big thing in later philosophy, and in a way is still around today. And we'll talk a bit about this when we talk about primary and secondary qualities. So solid matter, according to Democritus, is produced by atoms that have hooks or are rough, hooking together. Liquid, because it pours, smoothly, is produced by smooth atoms. Sweet things, although not all liquids, are also made up of special smooth atoms. And bitter things are made up of sharp atoms. So the idea that the experiences we have arise from other qualities. So for Democritus, sweet and bitter, in a way, are not out there in the world. It's the interaction between us and the atoms, or rather our atoms and other atoms. And again, this later gets developed, we'll talk about this in the future, into the primary-secondary quality distinction. Now, according to Democritus, there is no ordering principle beyond the properties of the atoms and random collisions from their motion. And so that brings us to the end of our good dead friend, Democritus. Next, we'll turn to our good dead friends, Plato and Socrates. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.